Hey there, welcome to today's video on Old Kingdom Egypt. Today we're going to be finishing up our series on the first part of Egypt. There's more to come with the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom eventually, but for today we already covered the starts of Egyptology with Napoleon. And last week what we looked at were three myths that kind of gave us an idea of why Egyptian culture developed the way that it did. I'm not going to get into anything to do with religion. I'm not going to get into anything too specific about like funerary rites or why they were building pyramids or why they were acting the way they did, because I already covered that. So this is a straight down the middle. This is history. To get started, we're kind of opening our scene in 3200 BC. Egypt exists as one of the first nations in the entire world. I feel like I'm starting at something which is kind of controversial to begin with. What is a nation? A nation is a community of people who are tied together through some means, be them real or imaginary, most likely religion, language, culture, something like that. And they have decided to exist within the same cultural contract, more or less. And that is what happened in Egypt. It is the first large-scale area that existed as a nation. I'm not talking about a civilization as was the case with Sumer, because that was a bunch of individual city-states with a bunch of different kings. They didn't exist under the same government, whereas Old Kingdom Egypt is one singular government over a large swath of people. And it does predate the Akkadian Empire, which is 2,300-ish. So Egypt exists as the first truly united nation. It was unified by Narmer or Menes or Aha. So it took several hundred years though from this early pre-forced military unification that we assume happened to the point where it was a fully functioning centralized state. That is Old Kingdom Egypt. But eventually what happens, and this is kind of the early dynastic period that I'm talking about, we're gonna have pharaohs who are attempting to set themselves up as kings in the north and the south. They move their capital to Memphis. They're southern kings, they're moving up north towards Memphis so they can centralize and localize their power there, kind of combined with north and south to make it one unified group. And they're creating as much bureaucracy really as they can so that they can effectively rule over this entire Nile River Valley region. And the ultimate structure that developed is very capable of doing these enormous building projects. You've seen them, it's the pyramids. Having these really fantastic expeditions to go mine, and then also eventually they do some military activity where they're able to go out, they're able to fight the people they want to fight, take their stuff, and go back home. So Egypt grows as a regional power through the, say, First through Third Dynasties, which is the early dynastic period, until it becomes a very significant regional power in the Fourth Dynasty. But before we get to a real discussion on dynasties, let's start with kind of before unification. We have the Nakada people, and there are the three distinct periods of the Nakada, which is the southern Nile River Valley people, and they start doing things that we would expect Egyptians to do. They're burying their people in sand pit tombs. They are including burial goods that presumably they will need in the next life. They are creating some really interesting pottery that's really quite beautiful. It has paintings on it, and it's going from the simple to the complex. So they're adding different lips, they're adding handles, they're adding shapes. So that means that they are starting to specialize in their skills. It's getting more complicated, which is a sign that a society within itself is getting more complicated. So we have the Nakada there, and then we have the Ma'adi and the Buto people in the north. They're a little more mysterious. The Delta region, unfortunately, from an archaeological standpoint, is much more difficult to excavate. A, there are a lot of people there now, and then B, there's just a lot of water up there in that kind of like swampy Delta region. It is very difficult to get in there and find remains. A lot of it's underwater. It's a complicated process to do archaeology in the Delta compared to the more kind of desert region where there's sand pits. And sand, if the body didn't get eaten by jackals, sand preserves very, very well. Writing is going to develop in about 3000, so about the same time of unification, you're gonna have your first hieroglyphic writing. From the start, it is both ideographic and phonetic, which means sometimes it's a picture that expresses an idea, and the crane is a crane or a bird is a bird with the picture. And then sometimes it means a sound. And the fact that hieroglyphs can do both is very confusing, but it can. And it can be written upwards, backwards, side to side. It can be written really any direction. It's kind of almost decorative. If you think about Arabic, it's kind of the same way, where Arabic, though it's only one direction that it can be written, it can be used decoratively. And the same thing is true of hieroglyphs. Probably, as with most civilizations actually, writing was developed as a form of keeping track of taxes. So bureaucrats looking to take money, it's the number one reason we have written records. Thanks, accountants. Early writings were also used kind of in commemorative art, early propaganda, basically. So you start creating a decorative art palette or a stela that you're going to put outside of whatever town you're in, and it's going to tell a story, and it's going to look pictographic, so people don't have to be able to read in order to say what it says, but it's going to be something that indicates like the king is just so powerful, the king is so good, the king was able to conquer this, the king was able to do this deed. By doing that, you're really shoring up your power base, because the word is the deed. If someone has put it on stone that this is what they've done, then of course they've done it. And a lot of early propaganda in Egypt functioned in this way, or it's almost like a bulletin board. The king did it, hooray! Most of the examples we have of very early hieroglyphs are kind of commemorative art or funerary art, and this is a persistent problem within Egyptology, that a lot of what is left to us is funerary. So it's going to be biased towards the very rich who could afford to have a stone tomb, or it's going to be biased towards just presenting the best thing you can say about the dead. So, it's the same way at a funeral now. No one gets up there and says, they were horrible. What they do is they say, they were great. They did this and this. They had a heart for this. They were always so generous. They were always so great. And it doesn't matter if you were always so great or always so generous. It's your darn funeral. They're going to say nice things about you. And it's the same thing with Egypt. So they always say nice things about you on your temple wall. We're not always totally certain if a king did the things that they say they did, or if they're totally exaggerated. It's a mixed bag. So it's a little bit of a discretion that you have to use in Egyptology of this whole explanation. This picture looks really similar to what's on that tomb over there. Is it possible the same artist did it, or an artist came and looked at this tomb and this wall and said, hey, this looks really cool. I'm going to copy this on his wall. That's writing, and it's developing, it's growing, and it is recognizable as the hieroglyphs that existed for the some 3,000 years that they were used consistently in Egypt. They were two separate kingdoms. They allegedly had a crown for upper and lower. There was some form of kingship, we believe. It's hard to know. That is what is depicted to us, though, in the Narmer Palette. And the Narmer Palette is King Narmer, King Menes, and he was from Upper Egypt, which is also Southern Egypt, because Upper and Lower Egypt are defined based on the direction that the Nile flows. Because the Nile flows from south to north up to the Mediterranean Sea, it switches their directional perspective in Egypt. So Upper is against the current, Lower is with the current. South is Upper Egypt, north is Lower Egypt. It took me a while, actually, to get my head wrapped around that. So I emphasize it so much because I think it's easy to get that kind of mixed up. And before the unification had happened, there was a certain amount of trade, we assume, via boat or donkey. We can assume that they were having contact. There probably was a certain amount of dialect or language sharing that was occurring. So I don't think that the conquest and the unification was totally out of left field. I think that it was starting to coalesce into an understandable, at least neighborly culture, if not united culture. And then it took our first pharaoh and the ultimate bureaucracy and centralized state that he developed to create what we think of when we think of ancient Egypt. And the first major documentation of that comes to us from the Narmer Palette, which I've mentioned a few times now. It has two sides. It is a commemorative palette. It was probably used to grind cosmetics, but not for daily use, probably for a statue of a god that would be used ceremonially. On one side, what we assume to be the front, Narmer is wearing just the white crown of Upper Egypt, and he is about to smite his enemy. He's holding the enemy by the hair. It is potentially the king of the north. On the other side, we have kind of a victory procession. The red crown is on Narmer, representing the unification of Egypt, and it shows the story of how Egypt has a single king who is a god on earth. This is kind of a sticking point for a lot of Egyptian history. They have the real God on earth. Other kingdoms may claim that they have a king that's a god. They do not. They have a maybe semi-divine king, because like Gilgamesh, for example, was semi-divine, not fully divine. in mythology. Their king is divine and here on earth, having direct communion with the gods. From an administrative standpoint, Egyptian history is broken up into dynasties, which are the ruling families of Egypt. So you're going to have, for the Old Kingdom, if you're including early dynastic period, say the First Dynasty through 7, and then you're going to have this intermediate period. We're going to cover both today, so that when we start with the Middle Kingdom, we're just going to open up with the Middle Kingdom. This is an imposed chronology. There's not always a very clear reason why it was broken up this way. It is an imposed chronology from the Ptolemaic times, and no Egyptian is going to be like, I'm living in the Old Kingdom in the Fourth Dynasty. This is purely a convention that originated much later in Egyptian history, in which historians have kept just because it's a little bit simpler to keep. If you're looking for a real reason why we went from the Third to the Fourth Dynasty, there isn't one. It's maybe architectural. It doesn't really hold up to any kind of real scrutiny. But in any case, the Egyptian state was successful for some 800 years. And that is what we refer to as the Old Kingdom. And that's how we kind of break up Egyptian history. So you have years of prosperity, an intermediate period, years of prosperity, an intermediate period, and then the New Kingdom. Most of the ancient Egyptians from the early dynastic period, most of the people were farmers. They lived in small villages. They survived based on what they could grow and then what resources they could gather from the Nile, be they fish or plants, anything like that. Cereal agriculture was the backbone of ancient Egypt. Villages became increasingly dependent on the cultivation of emmer wheat and barley, which were very successful crops in the Nile River Valley floodplain. The Egyptian economy relied heavily on state organization. Kind of that centralized state, what its real benefit was that it was able to prevent localized famines by saving and having in reserve grain. If one area had a really tough season, then the state was able to step in and be sure no one was actively starving. So the benefit of such a broad centralized state in Egypt is that they can lessen calamities when they come. They can have a unified force against any kind of invading peoples, keeping order from nomads that might be wanting to come in and pillage from farming communities. The First Dynasty, which is kind of where we're going to start this conversation, their main focus was in establishing the state and in developing kind of a unified cultural identity. And the two most important cities of this time period, and really for a lot of Old Kingdom, you're going to have Memphis, which is in the north, and Abydos as a religious center in the south. First Dynasty, we're talking from, say, 3025 BC until 2890 BC. The pharaohs of this dynasty are, you're going to forgive me, my pronunciation on all of this, okay? Okay, everyone, be kind. It's going to be Aha, Zur, Zet, Din, Queen Mereni, Anejeb, Semerket, and Ka'a. We're doing our best here, y'all. First job of the First Dynasty, establishing itself as a true centralized state, established this divine order, which is the kind of main job of the pharaoh. This order includes a standing army. Egypt was one of the first civilizations, I think it was the first civilization. Egypt was the first civilization that was able to have a fully standing army that they were able to feed. And that was the real benefit of their agriculture-based economy that was able to so consistently flood and so consistently grow. So the Nile floods every year in what is called the inundation. And it's very, very regular that the Nile floods. It floods to a certain amount. It can be measured. It can be marked. You know how much grain is going to be yielded based on the Nile's flood. And because of that, it was really easy for the pharaoh to collect taxes, because based on how high the Nile rose, which was kind of based on this Nilometer, that was how much grain you had to give the government. So it didn't matter how much you grew. You don't get to say I had a bad crop. You don't get to say, oh, it was just really hard this year. However much the Nile rose, that was how much grain you owed, and whatever was left is what you lived on. Because the government was able to get all this grain, they were able to feed a large army, because there was no money in Egypt until the Persian period. So up until that point, grain is going to be the main source of barter. The flooding of the Nile is something that was organized through building of irrigation canals, and they were able to kind of get the Nile water further away from just the Nile and kind of get more more of the valley ready for farming. And then also because they were able to store some water in canals, that was going to be very helpful to them when they, needed to water plants later. These were expected to be maintained, like the centralized government did expect this to be maintained, but it was up to local governments to be sure that they were. So it was up to individual cities of a region to be sure that their agricultural canals and irrigation systems were up to snuff. The capital was established at Memphis, but the center of religion was still going to be down in the south at Abydos. And this led to a practice of double burial. So the pharaoh would have some sort of burial up in Memphis and then some sort of burial down in Abydos. And one of them would include the true tomb of the king. But because it was working so hard on uniting North and South, they kind of wanted to symbolically represent Upper Egypt being buried and Lower Egypt being buried. So the pharaoh was doing both because the pharaoh represented both. Aha, who's the son of Menes, is the one who founds Memphis. The location was really important because it was kind of right there at the base of the delta. So if you were going to be invaded from the Mediterranean, then that's where they would be coming in. That's kind of our choke point if someone's going to come in from the Mediterranean. And then from either side, it's protected by desert, both the Western Desert and the Eastern Desert. An example of a tomb we do have is King Xerxes' tomb. It was found by Flinders Petrie, who's a pretty famous archaeologist back in the day. He's the one who kind of figured out that when you're excavating a site, you're looking at simple to complex to kind of comparatively date things if you're not going to be doing carbon-14 dating or something like that. But anyway, he finds, this is a funny story, actually. He finds King Xerxes' tomb. He finds an arm that may belong to King Xer or to his queen, and it's got jewelry on it. And they're really excited about this find. And he sends it off to the Cairo Museum. And the Cairo Museum takes the jewelry, but they throw out the arm. So Flinders Petrie has found a First Dynasty mummy, and they throw out the arm. They don't care about the mummies. And for a long time, people did not care about the mummies. They just cared about the jewelry and the jewels and the gold and the flashy stuff. But now we all kind of, I think, look at that and we're like, no, not a First Dynasty mummy. But there it is, it's gone. The arm of King Xer, alas. What the tombs of these first kings that we have, what they tell us is that already at this very early point, there were some really great imports that were coming in from the Levant. There were some really important grave goods that they found that show luxury items that at the very least were imported to be grave goods. In this specific time period, we're looking at burials in Saqqara, which is outside of Memphis, and then also a few at Abydos. From the First Dynasty, we hop over to the Second Dynasty. So we are still in the early dynastic period. This is from 2890 to 2686. The kings from this period are, oh no, Hetepsek-Himwi, Reneb, Nidjer, Wineg, Sened, Peribsen, Kasek-Himwi. Okay, so little is known, much less is known about the Second Dynasty. We have not found their tombs quite as effectively. So we know this is a time of economic and political solidification of the Egyptian state. Archaeological evidence shows that. It's still pretty scanty though. We're not quite sure why the Ptolemies decided to break here from the First and the Second Dynasty, because we're pretty sure that the first king, he finished the tomb of the last king of the First Dynastic period, which was Ka'a. Maybe it was his son, maybe it was someone who had some sort of reason for properly finishing the tomb. There is no break, as far as we can tell, in the succession. At Abydos, there are only 2 tombs and 2 funerary enclosures for Second Dynasty pharaohs. At Saqqara, tombs have a series of underground galleries near Zoser's step pyramid. We think that there was consolidation of power from the state bureaucracy and that it continued to grow and that taxation was used to support kind of some bigger projects for the crown, expeditions and goods for mining in the Sinai Peninsula, expeditions out to Lebanon. You want that cedar. And Lower Nubia in the Eastern Desert. We assume that conscription was something that was practiced for the sake of the military to go on the expeditions and the trading expeditions that the crown would have sent out, and then for the mining, and then also for any kind of large-scale temple building. The architecture, art, and beliefs of the Old Kingdom were really developed and fundamentally established kind of in this First, Second, Third Dynasty period. Zoser's step pyramid is a natural transition that we can make from the Second to the Third Dynasty. It's an architectural transition. So we're moving on from kind of these sandpit burials with maybe a mastaba on top to a true architectural grand structure when you're going to have more funerary temples and mortuary temples and causeways and things like that. So the state has to have money to build these things. And the fact that they're getting built in the third and not the second means that the state is growing in power, growing in importance. The belief in the pharaoh as Horus here on earth is growing. And that's how he's able to justify being able to spend all this money on building projects, to send out these expeditions for granite, for precious stones, for his building projects. Because the people aren't necessarily benefiting from this. They are spending a lot of money on all their taxes. They're going there. So they've got to be thinking to themselves, what is the tangible reward that I am receiving from the pharaoh building these projects? It's religious. So if you believe that the pharaoh is the god Horus here on earth, and that when he dies, then he's going to go to the other world and he's still going to be pharaoh. He's still going to have some sort of power on whether the Nile rise, whether the stars stay in the sky, whether things remain good for Egypt. If that pharaoh is still going to be doing that, you want him darn happy in his afterlife. You want him to have an awesome pyramid, and you want him to have a mortuary temple, and you want people to go pray for him and feed the gods and to really keep him happy for eternity, because this pharaoh is there to look out for the Egyptians' best interest. And that is what you are paying for with your taxes. So that's Second Dynasty. Again, it's kind of scanty when it comes to archaeological evidence, but once we get to the Third Dynasty, there's a lot more. Kings of the Third Dynasty: Zoser, Sekemket, Kaba, Senket, and Huni. Not a lot of kings there. And the time period is 2686 to 2613, which is also not really a lot of time either. Now that I'm looking at that, I didn't realize it was only like 70 years. It's not a long dynasty, you Ptolemies. So Zoser is the first pharaoh who gets buried in a pyramid. Hooray! The types of burials in Egypt originate with this classic sandpit burial that is existing before the dynastic time. But the problem with that is that the bodies, if they're buried in sand, kind of come right back up to the surface, or they get dragged up or dug out by wild animals, specifically jackals, and then they eat the body. And you're not gonna resurrect if your body's been eaten by jackals. That's a huge problem. So what they start to do, and this is kind of those early tombs with, say, Zur, they dig out all the way down to the bedrock, they cut a tomb into the bedrock under all the sand, and then they fill it back up again. And commemoratively, they might put a mastaba, which is kind of just a big square block on top, and maybe some sort of crude temple that your spirit can be worshipped at. But then Imhotep, yes, that Imhotep,
we are in serious trouble,
had this grand idea that, hey, what if we stacked mastabas on top of each other? And everyone was like, that would be great. And the step pyramid was originated. It was a huge thing, by the way. It was the largest stone building that had been built up to that point. It was like 3 or 4 times, I think, larger than any other building that was on the earth at the time. So this was a architectural marvel. The king's body, though, still was lying under the superstructure. So there's not a burial chamber inside of the step pyramid. It's still, they dug down to the bedrock, they made the tomb, they put the pharaoh in the tomb, and then they build the big monument on top of it. So this is not architecturally a very complex situation. And the step pyramid at this point is becoming the accepted burial of the king. This is what they're hoping to aspire to. The only problem is that no one else in the Third Dynasty was able to successfully complete a pyramid. Sekemket wanted to build a step pyramid, but he died before it was complete. I think it only got to like 7 or 8 meters tall when it was discovered. And when it was excavated, the burial chamber was still intact. The sarcophagus was still sealed, but when they opened it, there was no pharaoh. So the assumption there is that there were 2 burials that occurred. So maybe they did a ceremonial burial there and then a real burial somewhere else, which we haven't found yet. The remaining 3 kings that we have from this dynasty just didn't have time to complete their pyramids. Like I said, it was kind of a short dynasty, very compact. And because it was so short, they just didn't have time to build. It takes a lot of time, like 15 years to build a pyramid. So you need time for it. So when we look at our change from the Third Dynasty to the Fourth Dynasty, once again, it is architecturally based. So we're going from the step pyramid as there's only one. The step pyramid is the accepted architectural marvel of the time. And then we're moving on to the true pyramid with your friend and mine, the pharaoh Snefru. What a fun name. So the pharaohs for the Fourth Dynasty, which lasted from 2613 to 2494, were Snefru, Khufu, Jedefra, Khafra or Khephren, Menekre, and Shepsetkaf. I can say that. So Snefru is our big builder. He's if you're gonna know an Egyptian pharaoh from the Old Kingdom, the three you should know for their pyramids are Zoser, Snefru, Khufu. Snefru has the distinction of having probably built 3 distinct pyramids or structures or attempts. So the first one is at Medium, and that may have been his father Honey's tomb originally, but then he was experimenting with it. So we think that he was trying to build a step pyramid, and then he was like, what if I filled in the pyramid along the way and made it smooth on all the sides? But that didn't work, and all the kind of blocks started falling off, and it ends up kind of looking more like a tower than anything else. And he's like, bah, try again. And so he tries to build another pyramid, and this one has a lot of structural problems. And it's the bent pyramid is this one, and the corners of the pyramid are built kind of unstably. They're not leveled properly. And the burial chamber is really interesting. It's inside the pyramid proper. And so it's kind of one of those first corbelled roofs that we've seen. It's a little bit of real architectural innovation that's happening. And it's got a ceiling that's like 55 feet high. It's very impressive. So cracks in the burial chamber appeared. They had to use cedar from Lebanon, like these huge beams to try and give it some sort of structural integrity. But we don't think that the bent pyramid was really used. And then his final resting place, his third attempt, is the red pyramid, which is the world's first true pyramid. So, if at first you don't succeed, try again. It spends a lot of money, but hey, eventually you get, and you've figured out for everyone else how to build a true large-scale pyramid, which is what Snefru had. And then Snefru also was known for his expeditions that he sent out to the Sinai, and he was able to mine a lot of turquoise and create some really beautiful jewelry with it. By protecting the mine from the barbarians, he was kind of known as like the smiter of barbarians. So Snefru has like a pretty good reputation as far as like he did what a pharaoh was supposed to do. He built big structures to appease the gods. He sent out expeditions to get mining material. He was able to militarily beat back any kind of foes. And then he was able to go to Lebanon and to the Levant area and retrieve products for the Egyptians. So Snefru, good pharaoh by metrics that you judge pharaohs. He also really revolutionized art. So kind of a lot of those Egyptian standards that we know and love of what this is what Egyptian art looks like, those came into practice and were really even more standardized under Snefru. And then he also has these really cool life-size like portrait statues of his sons. We can kind of see from these that this was a time of prosperity because there's the statue of his son, and he's a big guy. He's a big fella. You don't get that big unless there's prosperity in the world. So Snefru really does have an intriguing character that we can kind of see from very far away in the past. He's kind of venerated as a great pharaoh for all of ancient Egyptian history, and people will say things like, not since the days of Snefru has it been this good or this prosperous. Oh, I long for the days of Snefru. And this is thousands of years later that Egyptians would say things like, oh, the good old days when Snefru was king. So he changed Egypt into a true regional power. So this is a step forward. We're out of the early dynastic period into the true Old Kingdom period. So this is Egypt as the regional power. What he established, the highs that he establishes here in the Old Kingdom, because this is a real peak for Old Kingdom, is the Fourth Dynasty. This is what everyone is trying to achieve for the rest of the Old Kingdom, and it's what's trying to be emulated in the middle in the New Kingdom. And then his son, Khufu, comes next, or Cheops. That's how Herodotus refers to him. And he is the builder of the Great Pyramid. So this pyramid is 480 feet high, and it was the highest building in the entire world until the Eiffel Tower was built. So that's a long time to be number one. The base covers approximately like 13.5 acres. It's huge. It's so big, and it is so level. They used some very ancient leveling techniques. And what's so impressive is it doesn't take good math to create something so level. It just takes meticulous planning and really trying to execute and being sure that it truly is level. which is what they did. So they did a good job. When you're asking yourself the question of why did these great pyramids get built? How did they get built? Please do not think to yourself, aliens. Please think instead that they were built through really meticulous and proper techniques, that they had some forms of pulley system. When you're building a great big pyramid, the way you quarry your rock is you just dig down to the bedrock, and there's the rock that you're using. So they're quarrying it there. They're not having to move it super, super far. And then they're going to use ramps and switchbacks along the pyramid to get it up to the top. So it's not aliens. It's allegedly from Herodotus, 2,000 years late. 90,000 men working in stints of 3 months at a time during the inundation of the Nile, where they're not going to be farming anyways, so they can go work on large building projects for the pharaoh. The grand gallery of the pyramid has a 28-foot high corbelled ceiling, very impressive. And the sarcophagus of Khufu is bigger than the doorway. So that means that what they did is before they officially built his doorway, they got the sarcophagus in there and then they built the doorway around it. And presumably that was so the sarcophagus, which was stone, so it wasn't like that valuable, but it was a stone sarcophagus and thieves couldn't steal it, would be the idea. So the pharaoh was like really going to stay in there. No one was going to steal his mummy. Our next pharaoh that we're going to care about is Khephren, or Khefra, depends how you say it. And he's the one who carved the Sphinx. Another thing that has gotten a lot of debate. And this is where carbon dating is very useful a lot of times and sometimes not very useful at all. It is very difficult to date stone. There's not carbon in stone. There's not carbon in a statue. You can't date it. So sometimes you'll see studies like the Sphinx is really such and such amount of years old. And it was probably carved by Khephren, and probably it is of him. Like, it's not a lady, it's probably the pharaoh. What happened, how we think it happened, is he's building a causeway from his mortuary temple, and usually that's a straight line. In the way, as they were digging out this causeway, this kind of covered walkway, there's this giant sandstone, and so they couldn't move it. Instead, they carved it into the Sphinx, and that's why his causeway is a little crookedy. And that's it. That's all the mystery there probably is to the Sphinx. He built a pyramid in Giza like his father, and cleverly, he built it on slightly higher ground. So that's why when you're looking at the two bigger pyramids, you're wondering to yourself, now which one's the Great Pyramid? It's because even though Khepren's pyramid is smaller, he built it higher so they look comparable in height. After Khephren, we have Menkaure, and he also built a pyramid, but it was made of different material and was smaller. So I think what happened, and this was probably very wise of Menkaure, is he didn't want to have to keep building a bigger and bigger and bigger pyramid, because the problem with that is, what if your pyramid is not complete when you die? You want your pyramid to be complete. There's no guarantee your successor is going to complete it. So it makes sense to build a smaller pyramid that takes less time to finish, but you use more luxury goods. So this pyramid, the one that Menkaure built, is going to have granite. Menkaure's son, Shepsetkef, he abandons the pyramid form. He builds a mastaba instead, and he is buried at Saqqara. And then we move on to the Fifth Dynasty. The Fifth Dynasty lasts from 2494 to 2345. The pharaohs of this dynasty were Userkaf, Sahareh, Neferkare, Shepsetkare, Menefereth, Nusere, Menkaure, Zedkare, and Unis. You should notice that some of these names end in Re. Re is the sun god. Also, I had to Google this because for a long time I thought it was Ra, and it is Re. Ra, I think they got the impression from Coptic that it was Ra, but it's apparently Re. So the pharaoh would use a name. This is kind of the typical naming conventions of pharaohs. They would use a name to represent themselves, represent what they meant to the gods, and which gods they valued the most highly. So by using Re in your name, then it's saying that like you hold a lot of respect for the sun god, and you want the sun god to specifically be protecting you. Also, we know, not just from Re, that they respected the sun. In the Fifth Dynasty, they built a lot of solar temples. Abu Ghurab in the South Saqqara is where a lot of these are. And then they built their pyramids near Abu Sir. So the cyclical nature of the sun, that it sets in the west, and the west is where dead things are. So it sets in the west, and then rises in the east where the live things are. And then the river is going to like rise and fall every year. So there's a lot of rebirth symbolism in Egypt, and that's what becomes very important to them. They believe in the resurrection. They believe in the Nile kind of as this yearly life and death thing. They believe in the sun that on the boat, because it's a boat that is pulling the sun. Horus and Ra are up there in the sun boat, and they're going down to the underworld. They say hi to Osiris every day, and then up they come in the east again, completely reborn. So King Unas is the last of this dynasty, and he is the one who had pyramid texts. So on pyramids, there were inscribed these kind of like magic spells, where when you think magic spell, you're probably kind of have this like Western view of what magic is. But in Egypt, a magic spell is going to just simply be the word is the deed. What is said is what is true. The pharaoh would have something on there like Osiris and Isis are there with Unas, and they will successfully lead him through the underworld. And because it is written in stone, then this is what actually is going to happen. The pyramid texts represent the earliest religious composition that is known in ancient Egypt. And it's one of the earliest religious texts anywhere. The Fifth Dynasty also saw the growing power of the nobles. So that we're going to be able to see is because we have more of their tombs. Officials and priests are going to have stone-cut tombs. They're going to have maybe occasionally like a little mini pyramid. They are buried near the king. And as more and more people are kind of buried with dignity, democratization of death that we're going to go into at the intermediate period. This is indicative that times are changing. Nobles are gaining power, priests are gaining power, and that is important for when we look at the intermediate period. And kind of this belief that maybe the afterlife isn't so dependent on the pharaoh. Yes, your works and your deeds towards the pharaoh matter in this life, but if perhaps you were buried properly, if you have the mummification, if your organs are properly preserved, if you have pyramid texts, if you have the right spells, maybe you too can go to the underworld, you can have your heart weighed, and you can enter into some sort of rest, much in the same way a pharaoh would. And that's pretty radical. Like originally the belief is that the pharaoh is the god, and that's the only reason any of this stuff works for him, because he's like Osiris. Osiris had all this happen and then he resurrects. So because the pharaoh is a god, he also will resurrect. But you, regular Joe, you, noble priest or not, that you think that you can do this also, that is a revolutionary change in thought. And it's happening here in the Fifth and Sixth Dynasties, which brings us to the Sixth Dynasty. Which is the last one we're going to talk about in any kind of detail. The Sixth Dynasty is from 2345 to 2181, and the pharaohs of the Sixth Dynasty are Titi, Userkure, Pepy I, Menenre, Pepy II, who also was Neferkure, and Nitiqueret. So the transition from this new dynasty probably had to do with the first pharaoh of this dynasty, Titi, marrying Unas's daughter. And this is something that Egyptologists call the heiress theory, that the person who became pharaoh was not always the pharaoh's son, especially if there were a lot of them. It was the one who married the woman with the best claim to the throne. A pharaoh was married to a lot of women, typically speaking, and he had one great wife though, and there wasn't a word for queen, but great wife is kind of the closest approximation that we can have. So the pharaoh is married to his great wife, and any children that he had with her are going to be the first ones to be in line for the throne. But say he doesn't have a son with his great wife, but he has a lot of other wives, and he's had lots of sons with them. Which one is the one who gets to be pharaoh, or which brother of his gets to be pharaoh, or which whoever, nephew? It's going to be the one who marries the daughter by the great wife. And this is true again and again and again all the way through the New Kingdom. Titi probably married Unas's daughter by his great wife. During the Sixth Dynasty, the kings continued to build kind of like smaller pyramids, but they weren't nearly as impressive as the pyramids that were built in the Fourth Dynasty. And then the power structure is changing as the pharaoh is seen less and less as a god. And a kind of an example we have of this is there was an assassination attempt on Pepy I, and it was from the harem. And there was like this whole courtroom trial thing that we have a record of. The fact that this is well known, if Pepy I is a god, then no one's going to assassinate him anyway. But here he is touchable, and they're very concerned about this. So it gives this impression to pretty much everybody that maybe Pepy I is not as much of a god as we thought he was. And that's really going to diminish his power. Also, it could be that they took it less serious than we are imposing upon them. Historians are pretty sure that Egyptians really did view the pharaoh as the son of Horus, or Horus on earth, but maybe that's something that we're kind of placing more firmly on them than we need to. Maybe, in the same way, that certain documents might say a certain something, it doesn't necessarily mean that every single person really thought in this way. We just have the records that are left to us, and we're extrapolating a whole lot on 800 years of history from these records. Here, where we're seeing Pepy I being less than deified, was this a one-off or was this something that happened regularly? We don't necessarily know. The records may not survive to us. They didn't inscribe things on clay tablets. They inscribed things on papyrus, which sometimes just doesn't last. So the Sixth Dynasty, we have all that happening. The nobles are building mastabas, which really can rival the pharaoh's burial, which is a big sign that the nobles have a lot of power. When it comes to an end, this dynasty, we have the total collapse of the Egyptian centralized state. So that's from the Mediterranean to Aswan. That's the full Egyptian centralized state. It's going to fracture now. Pepy II is our last pharaoh from this period, and he has the longest rule of any monarch ever. So he gets the throne when he's like 6, and he lives to be in his 90s. It's a super long rule. This is where the duties of the pharaoh, that he's going to be able to lead his people into battle, that he's going to be kind of this vigorous man who can go and defend Egypt's borders. If you've got a really, really old person as the pharaoh, they can't go do that. Maybe his sons could do that, but then his sons are getting old too. And who knows that his grandsons, who are never going to even sniff the throne, are going to be inclined to do that for grandpa. We don't necessarily have the clearest picture of what actually caused the decline though, so this is somewhat speculation on my part, but it is believed that there was a declined ability to mount expeditions into Lebanon and to go mining and to keep the Bedouin and nomadic peoples out of Egypt. Trade grew in other ways, so Egyptians were finally able to cross those first cataracts and get down to the third or fourth cataracts, which means that they were much more able to trade with Nubia or Kush. And this gives the impression that Egypt was kind of leaning away from a more Levant-focused trade and into a more African-focused trade. We officially have the intermediate period, which is going to be dynasties 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, which sounds like a lot, but it's not really as much as you think. So I'm not going to be naming every pharaoh's name. That would be silly, and I will not do it. My voice would go. But these are how the 5 dynasty kind of conventions generally work. The 7th and 8th dynasties allegedly had just a lot of kings, and it might have been hyperbole. We don't know exactly. Like there was one that there were 70 kings in 70 days, and they all had the same name of Nefertari, which is what Pepy II had. Her Acropolitan is where the 9th and 10th dynasties are based out of, and then the 11th dynasty is going to concurrently exist down in Thebes. And the 10th dynasty was defeated by the Theban kings, who eventually were able to consolidate power and form the Middle Kingdom out of that. So for a good long while, the intermediate period was viewed as kind of just like this horrible time in Egyptian history. And the literature of the period is kind of a very lamentation style. So it's a longing for a time in the past. It's bemoaning that the old kingdom's not here anymore, and that, you know, it's better to commit suicide than continue to live in this specific land. And this might be more from the Middle Kingdom than the actual intermediate period, which kind of implies a certain amount of propaganda that maybe that the Middle Kingdom is trying to shore up its new dynastic rule by saying, hey, you don't want to go back to that intermediate period. It was horrible. You want to go back to the good old days of the Old Kingdom. And that's what we, the 12th dynasty, are here to promise you. We've given the intermediate period a more calamitous view than is totally accurate based on some sources from the Middle Kingdom. During this intermediate period, the centralized government did cease. And the advantages of a unified state really were lost. There were kind of some low Niles, we think, in this time, which meant that there wasn't as much food. There probably was some starvation. Time does pass, and the Nile did rise again, and ancient Egypt is a food basket. This was a thriving time for the Egyptian middle class. So you have merchants that were kind of starting to trade more independently, and because there isn't a centralized state that is taxing the bejeebas out of you, like it's more of a localized tax, then they're not building these huge building projects and temples anymore, and they're not sending out these expensive expeditions looking for precious gems, and they're not sending out expensive trade routes. If they're not doing all of these things, then that means you might have a little more jangle in your pocket. And we can tell that because there's a lot more art, and it's experimental art. What experimental art tells us is that people were able to pay for art. They wanted art. They saw what the old fancy rich people had, and they're like, I want me some of that. So they ask an artist to make it for them. But this artist has maybe a huge demand, or maybe you can't get the best artist because they have so much demand, so you get a less good artist, and they're not trained in the same ways. So they're kind of making their own artistic styles. It is an artistic revolution that is very rare in Egypt. Usually it's a very standardized art practice. Strange art period in Egyptian history is implying the middle class is trying to get a little bougie up in here. They are looking to put on the trappings of wealth, and that means art. Ordinary people, this is also kind of, part of it too. Ordinary people are getting tombs. Ordinary people are having coffin texts, and maybe they can't read the coffin text, but they got them, and they're going to have spells to properly enter into the afterlife. So that means that you, an ordinary person, you're having a tomb, you're getting mummified, you're having a coffin text. So you, just like a pharaoh of old, are going to be able to resurrect in the next life. This is a huge evolution in thought that is occurring during this intermediate period. So common people have spells. Common people have art. This doesn't sound like the doom and gloom that is often characterized the intermediate period. This sounds like a time when there wasn't such a strict and centralized state. And the strict and centralized state does have benefits because people were kind of focused on the now. They were not looking at kind of long-term trade issues. They're looking at short-term local problems. And that means when calamities occurred, then they would impact these people far greater. There wasn't any kind of safety net to catch any problems that were happening. What ends up happening is eventually the Theban kings of the 11th and then eventually the 12th dynasty, they're able to reunite Egypt and adapt and adopt a lot of the things of the Old Kingdom into Middle Kingdom culture. So we're going to go next time that we visit Egypt, we're going to be talking about the Middle Kingdom. We'll be starting with the 12th dynasty with Mentuhotep II. Then we'll keep chugging from there through the Middle Kingdom. But we're not doing that next on the history portion of this channel. Next time I am planning to do an episode on early China, where we examine how civilization developed from the Neolithic peoples in China to the First Dynasty. So that concludes Old Kingdom Egypt. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time.